we think we all have the same understanding of what those foods are. It's sugary cereals. It's all those scary things we mentioned, donuts and unfortunately.
We just had a few donuts. I'm sorry.
Josiah, keep your mouth closed. You don't need to out us. This is Generation Health. We bring you the latest news, cutting-edge research, and time-tested best practices helping you live a longer, healthier life. Across from me, PharmD, Dante DiMatteo. What's up, man?
Not much. How are you?
I'm good. You're in Joey DiMatteo, PharmD, board-certified clinical nutritionist.
Switching it up. I am.
For those watching, we have changed seat positions for no reason, just felt like doing it.
Trying new things out.
That's it. Josiah Schweinberg.
I'm in the same seat back here.
Yeah, you don't get to move. Engineer extraordinaire. How you doing?
Doing well.
Excellent. I'm Tyler Andrews, the host. Guys, we are going to talk about, I'm actually, this is fun. Everybody's been talking about ultra-processed foods for quite a while. It is on every article about health. It is either a demon or completely irrelevant, depending on who you ask. Lots of people have lots and lots of opinions. So we're going to solve it all today. We're going to answer all the questions. And if everybody would just listen to us, then there wouldn't be any problems after this, right?
That's right.
As always.
Excellent. Good. I'm glad I have a total buy-in from you guys. No, that's not true. But we are going to talk about ultra-processed foods. Make America Healthy Again. The campaign has really put a strong emphasis on that. There's been a lot of talk about it. What do we got going on? Dante, this was your idea. Why are we talking about this again? Ultra-processed foods are bad. We know that. What else is there to talk about?
So California's governor, he signed the Real Food Healthy Kids Act into law. This was October at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And the law directly aims to identify and ban ultra-processed foods from schools by 2035. So the core of the issue is not that anyone's going to argue with that, on its surface, that, again, everyone everywhere is talking about how bad ultra-processed foods are. We've talked about the GLP-1 use. We've talked about the obesity epidemic, all of those sorts of things. And many times quickly people have the retort as if it's only the food and the types of foods that are causing these problems. So when you hear that a law has been set into motion to hopefully stop this in its tracks, maybe you can get on board.
At least with kids.
Right.
Yeah, and to
exactly
steel man that argument, if you overlay the rates of obesity with the prevalence of ultra-processed foods on a timeline, those curves are going to be very similar. They're going to look very convincing that one is equal to one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's define ultra-processed food.
Really, that's where the issue comes in.
That's right.
Is that that's the crux of it. We still haven't been able to agree upon, we as in,
society.
Yes. And the individuals that came up with the NOVA classification, they have their own sort of definition. Policymakers have their own definition. Those in nutritional epidemiological research, maybe err on the other end of the spectrum of the definition. So to put a law into action that is essentially, again, going to ban these food products from menus, if we don't know exactly what they are and we can't agree upon what the certain criteria are that constitutes processed or not processed, or again, it's because it's this huge spectrum of things and they're not all created equal. It's very hard to agree. So I mentioned the NOVA classification. That's what's currently being used. And this entire concept of ultra-processed foods comes from this system by a Brazilian researcher. Again, he put this into motion, and that's how it's in most of our, our vernacular at this point. So there are 4 categories: group 1, group 2, group 3, and 4. 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed foods, fruits, vegetables, plain yogurt, fresh meats. Group 2 is processed culinary ingredients. So these are the things you cook with: oil, butter, sugar, salt. 3, these are just processed foods. And you would think of these as simple industrial products made by adding ingredients from the second group to the first group. So these are canned vegetables, certain types of cheeses, freshly made or unpackaged bread. And so you think about the thing, you know, salt, sugar, things to preserve these foods longer. You know, kick those foods down a level, so to speak. The fourth group is the ultra processed foods. This is the one everyone is talking about and is scared of at this point. They're not defined as modified foods, but completely an industrial formulation. So they usually have 5 or more ingredients. They have components that are extracted from foods like high fructose corn syrup, protein isolates, or they're made in labs with cosmetic additives. And this is where everybody gets up in arms about the colors, the flavors, dyes, the emulsifiers, which make them really enjoyable. So soft drinks, packaged snacks, instant noodles, frozen meals, the whole 9 yards, mass-produced cereals, mass-produced breads, all of those types of foods.
Because, I mean, those first 3 are pretty standard everyday things. I would imagine a processed food you could think of the dinner mom made or grandma made would be considered a processed food by these definitions. And you said this is the Nova scale?
It is. Okay. It is. And so Carlos Montero, it's important to understand that this wasn't like a panel at the time, wasn't a panel of experts that came up with this. This was somebody who was trying to, you know, put some sort of bumpers on the food, is it the nutrients? Is it the food processing? What are the different levels of food processing?
Yeah. Wrap his brain around it.
Yes, exactly. And so it was merely a hypothesis that has now been birthed into this huge thing.
Yeah. I wonder.
Yeah.
Carlos probably did not intend for it ever to get to the conversation that is at right now. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the ultra processed foods are the ones we're talking about, not those prior 3 really, even though we all know like butter, there's a limit on how much you can reasonably eat, even though it's a culinary ingredient. It's the type 2, it's the air quotes safe thing. It's not supposed to be your whole diet. Mm-hmm. But let's get into the ultra processed because that is why we're here. What is the problem with calling ultra processed foods less desirable?
So the issue is that in practice, it is still quite subjective, and those that will critique Montero's classification, the definition was described as much as a social one as it is one based on the specific ingredients. So, going even further into definitions, the California has actually defined it themselves in their new law, and theirs really just targets foods high in saturated fat, sodium, or sugar that also contain additives like artificial colors, sweeteners, and emulsifiers. So at this point, the FDA has their stance on these sort of things, and it is just
it's getting clearer, and everybody's got it figured out, and we're good to go. Okay, so if we don't all have the same definition, if we're not working from the same playbook, why in the world are we trying to ban things kind of willy-nilly?
Mm-hmm. I think we think we all have the same understanding of what those foods are, and it's fruit, it's sugary cereals, it's all those scary things we mentioned, donuts and unfortunately
we just had a few donuts. I'm sorry,
Josiah. Keep your mouth closed. You don't need to out us.
So the main reason, and it's tough to argue with, but it's the observational epidemiological data linking ultra processed foods to poor health outcomes, and the results are, at a glance, are staggering. There was a 2024 review in the British Medical Journal. They synthesized findings from 45 different meta-analysis of over 10 million people, and there was a convincing link with ultra-processed food exposure leading to a 50% increased risk of cardiovascular related death, and also a 12% greater risk of type 2 diabetes. There was also highly suggestive evidence that there was a 21% higher risk of all-cause mortality, and again, convincing evidence that there was anywhere up to 53% of a higher risk of anxiety and other common mental disorders. So you start hearing figures like this, And I mean, any normal person would begin to be concerned.
Okay, those are horrifying numbers, but I mean, just like a rise in obesity and an increase in ultra processed food, this is corollary data. This is not causal data.
Mm-hmm.
So
exactly,
could it not be that people with higher instances of anxiety are driven to then eat highly ultra processed foods to make themselves feel better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a ton of, confounding variables in this case that we can't really control for as much as we want to. We can't control for every single factor. There's residual confounding no matter what you do in these instances. And in the case of this research, it is, from my understanding, exceptionally high. So all of the data in these studies, for example, in the one with over 10 million participants, they are either all very low quality or low quality evidence. So you just stack up a bunch of data of evidence that's maybe hit or miss in and of itself. Just because you stack it on itself doesn't make it the end all be all. And I don't want to completely, disregard this, but it is really, it's really important. And again, back to the whole definition thing. These authors didn't really, to actually answer one of your early questions, I don't even really think there was a uniform definition that they were answering to when looking at these studies and the foods that were being eaten. We all know at this point, if you've listened to this show, we've said that it's very difficult to really get a snapshot of what somebody's overall eating pattern is like. I mean, you can sort of get an idea with 24-hour recall and survey and those sort of things, but man, we know from tracking our food that you think you're 100% accurate, and there could be a day you just completely miss a meal that you entered, or you forget about the 24 pretzels you had at work, let alone people who are being surveyed and medical information is being looked at after the fact. The whole thing is just ripe with issues. So what, I think the counter to all of this, and there are some, and I think we'll talk about it. There are definitely some mechanisms at play that could be in support of a direct causal issue when, with consuming ultra processed foods. But some of the major downsides in this case would be, firstly, the link of socioeconomic status. And that's the most powerful confounding variable, I think, in this instance. The higher in ultra processed food content someone's diet contains, the more likely they are to be lower income, lower educational attainment, other similar markers of socioeconomic disadvantage. And that's just the reality. So we know that independently is one of the strongest predictors of poor health outcomes just across the board. So really what we're dealing with is ultra processed food just a proxy in this case, as opposed to, the end all be all. It's because they're eating this. It's really just that, like, well, hey, these people are not making these choices, but they're sort of, it's deeply embedded in that way of life. And that really the bigger issue underlying that is just the, some of those unfortunate issues.
For sure. Let's get real practical for just a second. Mm-hmm. For the purposes of this conversation, what are some examples? And Joe, you can chime in on this too, obviously. What are some examples of healthy, air quotes, ultra processed foods and clearly not healthy ultra processed foods? Things that it's cool and things that we should probably avoid just in general, regardless of its processing level. Mm-hmm. But for the purpose of bringing clarity to our working definition, we'll do the easy ones first. What are some examples of not really great ideas?
I mean, I think the key ones are anything with like high fructose corn syrup, things that are very high in sugar content. I think that's the most basic. Next step would be fried foods. So, and again, we can keep, I keep kind of, thinking like the veer general, but I think this is a step in the right direction, but it's just kind of another step towards like these hard lines of like, well, this is the new villain.
Right.
So first it was fat and then it's sugar. Well, now we can draw this ultra processed foods line, and And I think what would be much more productive would be to look at something that's more complicated, which oftentimes, leads to things not getting done, but some type of panel to decide maybe what ingredients should be banned, processed or not. It just seems crazy to throw away things like Dave's Bagels and even for a lot of people, fortified basic regular cereals and things like that. And to lump in things like Kashi brand whole grains and Fiber One foods with basically in the same category as sodas and as
Oreos.
Pop-Tarts and Oreos. Yes. So again, I think broadly speaking, it's a step in the right direction, but we can name many things that are, even when we looked at, you brought up at the beginning the clear rise that correlates ultra-processed food consumption with the obesity rate. But there was one other thing, and it was interesting because it's one of the protected foods, which is cheese. The cheese
Protected in the California law.
California law, yes. So cheese intake from 1909 to 2025 rose from less than 4 pounds a year per person to 40 pounds per person. A 10-fold average intake of cheese. And this goes back to what Dante talks a lot about the saturated fat content. That's 70,000 calories a year per person of saturated fat, mostly saturated fat content.
But cheese
so there's a whole lot of things.
good.
I know, I love it too. But it's just, whenever instead, if we had some type of system that would, yes, again, nix certain ingredients, high fructose corn syrups, et cetera, but then also maybe just limit the amount of sugar. It can be as processed as you want it to be. It can only have X amount of sugar per meal in a lunch, or you can only have X amount of saturated fat. Because what's going to happen is cheese is protected, so pizza is protected. And then you're just, how many of these schools from a financial and to keep kids eating are like, well, we have pizza 3 days a week and we're falling under the guidelines. You know what I mean? So again, I think I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to say, because I still think this is a general step in the right direction. But as with so many health things we talk about, it's way more complicated. And I think something that deals with the macro and micronutrient consequences of this. Because when you throw out a lot of these processed foods, you're throwing out a lot of micronutrient content as well that people aren't getting at home. So I think something a little more broad-based in terms of just looking at the macro and micro and not so much processed or unprocessed. Mm-hmm. Sorry to kind of go off on a tangent with it, but there was a few things that I was kind of stewing on.
No, I'm glad. Jump in. Okay, that was all fantastic, but he also didn't answer my question.
Yeah,
so Dante.
I feel like I didn't get to talk yet, so I had to talk.
No, this is good.
Anything else you want to talk about before we... I'm kidding. You don't get to talk anymore.
I'm sorry.
Dante, give me some examples. Some clearly good ultra-processed foods, some clearly bad ultra-processed foods. Kind of help us clarify what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So we would think of, again, things like soft drinks, Coke, Pepsi, those that have the full amount of sugar or have the non-nutritive sweeteners.
Right.
Those all are lumped into that category. Frozen meals for the most part. You can get pretty healthy frozen meals that are lumped into this category because of, again, that extra level. This is group 4 ultra processed. Breads and cereals find themselves in that 4th category too, which in essence are going to be cracked down upon.
Yeah.
If you go up a level to just processed foods, again, you see canned vegetables and canned fruits and those sorts of things that I don't really know that are upsetting most people, and I view things like applesauce and squeezy pouches that every kid is eating at this point. Those sorts of things usually will fall.
As long as they're not covered in syrup, it's
right.
Probably fine.
Right. Maybe does that begin to answer it? Is that
I think a little bit.
What do you want? What do you want to hear from me?
Well, I'm thinking of like yogurt. We've talked about in the past. The Greek yogurt qualifies as an ultra processed food. You have to put stabilizers in there. You got to make sure that it doesn't go bad within 24, 36 hours. So that's in there. You've got things like protein powders or any of the protein enriched foods. Those are clearly ultra processed foods, but they're not necessarily bad.
Yeah. But the issue here, even the yogurt aspect just sort of triggered something in my mind. And it's just that it's such a ridiculous conversation at some point. Plain yogurt is in unprocessed category 1.
Oh, is it?
But if you have Oikos 000, which has no really added sugar, has higher protein. It tastes amazing. It's like, feels like it should be a dessert and is pretty nutritious.
Yep. Had one this morning.
From my understanding, trying to interpret these categories, would find itself in category 4. Or if you use something sweetened with like a Splenda or whatever that has no nutritive value, it gets lumped into this lower category. And it's why, like, is that really what we're arguing against too?
Yeah.
And I'm sure, yes, for some people, yes, they're going to die on that hill every time. They think it's insane. They think I'm insane for even saying that. And then it's also like, well, why do they need to make a yogurt that has the fruit swirl in it? Just eat the plain yogurt. Well, I mean, what really? Like we're going to harp on that. And that's where it's troublesome.
Yeah.
And when we look at the original article that we talked about in MedPage, it's, the columnist just basically says, rather than try to define them, let's just try to focus more on how the foods actually affect health, whether or not they are processed or not. And and I think my view of that has changed over the years. And I think things really do come down to a case by case basis. But in the broadest stroke, I'm finding myself more in that camp because me and you will go back and forth about the plain yogurt versus the 000 yogurt versus the little bit of sugar yogurt. Like really banning, we're going to ban those, and that's going to move the needle here. Sure.
It'd be good for the kids in California probably to eat some 000 yogurt as opposed to
yogurt.
Pudding.
Yogurt is a humongous part of my diet at this point.
Yeah.
It is cheap for relatively cheap. You can buy yogurt affordably for the most part, no matter where you go. You can get it plain. You can get it you can mix it with yogurt or mix it with oatmeal. You can mix it with anything.
Yeah.
Mix it with fruit and just get a massive bang for your buck in terms of protein.
Yep.
It blows my mind that that's even a part of this.
Here's what, and instead of going like to this villain standpoint of ultra processed foods are villains, here's what they do in Europe. Plenty of issues with how they regulate and do things over there. Food, supplements, diet, they're usually pretty good. So here's what they do, Germany, France, UK. They give food a grade, A through E. You get positive points for your percentage of fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts, or specific oils. Positive points for fiber, positive points for protein. Negative points for total calories, saturated fat, total sugars, and sodium. So how does that play out? You look at something like a fortified whole grain cereal. High fiber points. Moderate sugars, they get dinged. Neutral on the iron, folate, and vitamins, they get a B. Cheese gets a D or an E. Why? Very high negative saturated fat, no fiber, some protein. Get a D, an E, not an F. Sweetened yogurt gets a neutral. Why? Because it has some added sugar, but it does have calcium, micros, and protein. So I think that's just kind of getting to the root of I love this score system that's not so much based on processed or not, but some like the Greek yogurt you brought up. Yes, you could compare what an Oikos 000 is in a score and give it a grade versus what just kind of a hardcore like junk yogurt could be, which is still, something like that. So I thought this was a little more direct about what I think makes the most sense here. But we tend to again have like this is the villain, and then we shape political decisions around that and villainize certain things.
And not to necessarily critique that, because I think we've even maybe talked about this, like front of label packaging, like those sorts of changes that they're almost like tools to just educate the person who's not really interested or paying attention or looking at labels.
Sure.
Just something a little more like green or red or yellow or just something to maybe get people thinking a little bit. But then again, it's like even that has its drawbacks. The main issue I think is, I've read that they call it the health halo effect, where an ultra processed food is marketed as healthy based on its star rating.
Right.
And so it's like creates a perverse incentive to then just like add fiber or add a protein isolate or something to game the system to earn a higher score, as opposed to like not worrying about it in the first place. But it's just that some constraint is required for food manufacturers. Some incentive has to be there for them to make changes. If they're not incentivized change them for the better,
Right.
then what are they going to do? But again, now you have this wave of, it's already happening. Everything has protein. Everything is just shifted that way to just create this like shelf appeal.
Yeah.
And not that those foods are bad, but it's like, okay, so now every single thing is just going to have a star or not a star, it's.
Yeah, I hear you. I guess it just feels like it's a good guideline. It's a closer to the mark guideline. Cause I guess in your example, maybe the initial food's a D, and then yes, they do game the system and they add some fiber and protein and they get a C. I don't know. I agree that that's not perfect, and somebody with your knowledge and interest in this is going to go the level deeper. But I think for the average, I still think it's a net win.
Yeah.
Just in my opinion, I think it's a net win. And I think what would be interesting to me is to have schools say, whatever, you're only allowed to serve 3 C's during the week. You're allowed to serve 1 F during the week as a treat. And otherwise you must be made up of B's and D's. And yes, would there be some gamification and you'd have mac and cheese fortified with of course. Mm-hmm. But I still think that gets us a little closer to the mark than expecting, every, this incredible dietitian in every school district or, in a political standpoint to have to make these hardcore decisions where at least there's a little more of a panel, a little more of a net win kind of guide than just banned ultra processed. Even though, again, back to the very beginning, I still think it's a general step in the right direction.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I really do. And just taking for 1 second, just taking your eyes off the processing momentarily is nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just because it was manufactured doesn't necessarily mean it's the worst thing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me, and correct me, it seems like what I hear you saying is personal responsibility, understanding the basics of macronutrition and micronutrition to the extent you can, and trying to, on an individual level, make sure you're making healthy choices, or at the very least healthier choices than what you did yesterday will lead you in the right direction. And if that looks like a fortified cereal as opposed to a purely junk cereal, great. And if that looks like then next time, maybe you move out of the cereals and you get into oatmeal or something. Is that a fair?
And I think we always kind of end up doing the same thing. It's like, we could easily have come in here and say, this is perfect. I love what they're doing. Or we could easily come in here and have a hot headline and say, this is absolute garbage. Here's why.
Yeah.
We do what we usually do, which is add color and nuance. And I think get to a better ultimate just understanding of there's some good here. It's generally good, but here's why. And if you sit and listen to a 20-minute version of this, you probably do care enough to understand the nuance and get something out of it, I would hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. It ends up being some non-inflammatory view of the whole thing. And yeah, you
but
open
still important stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And then people just have to not be afraid to broaden their horizon of foods. The grocery store is pretty awesome when you're not afraid of certain things. I mean, my goodness, if you shop mostly around the outside, that's still probably best, but then you can have some fun on the interior. There's some better ways than others to do it. Yes, there really is.
Well,
I did want to just circle back to the drawbacks of some of the epidemiological studies. I know we talked about socioeconomic status. I think that's like the most inflammatory part of all this are some of those views potentially, the responsibility. Is it their responsibility? Is it not? The last thing I'll say about that is in environments of lower socioeconomic status, there's more of this, they call it a permissive pattern, where the highest intake of ultra processed foods like hamburgers, soft drinks, things we mentioned, they were greatly associated with those households. So these parents were those that may not have held jobs. They were living in social housing, those sort of things. In contrast, if we look at restrictive patterns, that's those with the lowest intake of ultra processed foods. And of course, it's associated with higher socioeconomic status. So there's just all these things underpinning certain dietary choices. And sure, if you're in a situation that lends itself to much more fast food, cheaper foods, every single food has some level of processing, some level of added sodium, some level, and you couple it with the next tier, lifestyle factors. Those that are consuming the most ultra processed foods, they're way more likely to engage in other unhealthy behaviors, less physical activity, more smoking, more sedentary time, things that are independent risk factors alone. So you begin to combine all these things. Like, was it really just the level of processing here that's driving people insane? I don't think it is, and there's my inflammatory stance. I think it's the processing is certainly absolutely a part of the conversation. Is it the magic bullet? I really doubt it.
I look at even just my grocery situation, and I buy a lot of fruits and vegetables, but we buy some processed food too. And I never end up throwing away the processed food because it stays. Yep. And I end up, my kids eat a lot of fruit and vegetables, and so do I. I end up throwing away a lot of apples and a lot of fruit and a lot of lettuce. And even if you say, well, look, it's only the X dollars. Well, the reality is some of that stuff's getting thrown away. The processed food never does. I think the socioeconomic thing is absolutely valid.
Default, like there becomes a default into what you stock your home with.
Yeah.
Yep. It's convenience, it's cost, it's your background, it's all those things that lend itself to a decision. And so I'm not claiming that I have the answer to unwind those things. And at what link in the chain do we go back and educate and inject money here or do this or government involvement, ban this food, do this food, put this star on it, A+, C+. Like what? I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's just complicates the entire understanding. And then the last thing with these studies is just overall diet quality. High ultra processed food intake, almost by definition, is a marker of poor overall diet quality, right? They're consistently shown to be lower in fruit, vegetables, fiber, and then usually higher in total energy. And this is due to higher sugar.
You mean calories?
Yes. Total calories, energy, synonymous. Yes. In this case, added sugar, there's added sodium, and then these added, for a while, it was trans fats, and now it's just general saturated fats for the most part. And so this raises the whole chicken or the egg question that we've come back to time and time again. Is the harm caused by these foods themselves and the presence of these foods, or is it because their diet is made up largely of these foods and there's this absence then of the nutrient dense protective foods that can start to maybe offset some of these choices that you make in eating processed foods? So there is just this, like you always say, like, well, what are you replacing with? What did we displace these foods with? And if that's all you're surrounded by and you're sick of throwing away your spinach every week, then guess what? You're going to buy the frozen and you're going to buy the canned, or you're just going to skip some of the produce altogether. So what are we replacing it with? We can mitigate the risks associated with some of these foods by adding more oatmeal, adding more fruit, more foods that are high in fiber, and you can counteract it. So it's not saying that like you can just out eat a bad diet per se.
Yeah.
But there is this level of like somebody eating 80% processed foods versus 50%. It raises a good question.
Most people eating to satiation are going to have some sort of caloric ceiling that they won't get past. And if you eat 50% more whole foods, then theoretically that should reduce your ultra processed, or whatever you want to call it, bad food consumption pretty markedly. Is that what you're saying?
Definitely.
Okay. All right.
Definitely. And that's, people who are eating tons of red meats and they're interested in maybe cutting back saturated fat. What do we say? Well, it's just replace it with some avocado, replace it with this low fat cheese or low fat Greek yogurt or something, something. It's just, it is really just this game of trade-offs at the most granular level. So you're right. The last bad thing I want to say about these epidemiological studies in general,
and these are the studies that everybody's kind of basing all of this on.
Exactly. So there's something called a negative control analysis, and it's really just designed to detect confounding variables by testing an association that is not expected to be causal. So in this case, in 2023, there was a study that in addition to being associated with certain cancers, higher ultra-processed food consumption was also associated with an increased risk of accidental death. So falls, transportation accidents, drowning. So I don't say this to like really, stick it to the ultra processed food haters, but like, it's just to say, man, zoom out and we can make any graph. We can make any graph look the way you want, for goodness sake. Look at the incidence of accidents. Yeah. Accidents in ultra processed food. What? There's some underlying mechanism that makes people have a greater propensity to
when
falling.
You eat Twinkies, your response rate goes down.
Yeah.
And therefore
that's where you look at some of the socioeconomic stuff and where does that come from? But it does.
Right. So it's just, again, I'm saying this in terms of, again, the ultra processed food is a proxy. It's maybe more of a signature of what's happening, as opposed to the processing level being the sole driver of why we need to ban foods and do all this crazy stuff.
Exactly.
The food is unhealthy, not because it's processed, but because of what it contains.
Mostly. Yeah, exactly. The other thing is we've talked about processing, like what is actually happening when these foods are processed. We've talked about hyperpalatability. They're really good to eat. The environment, we're constantly hungry because of what we're surrounded by. And so there is an element that all of this engineering of hyperpalatability is something to watch, because I think it's currently out of hand, right? Like that's, I think, what maybe a lot of these laws are after, is like there hasn't really been any clampdown on what food engineers are doing. They're just saying, hey, their boss is telling them to make this food taste better. You need to sell more, and it is what it is. Like, what are you going to do?
As soon as carrots start outselling Twinkies,
right,
I'm sure that Hershey's will be all over that.
Right. Right. And so even that is a whole thing. So if we flip the script and we looked at some of the mechanisms possibly by which ultra processed foods are causing issues, it's things like altering the food matrix, which then alters the eating behavior.
What is that?
So certain industrial processes like extrusion, puffing, grinding, they actually disrupt like the physical characteristics of the food ingredients.
Okay.
That's why the food matrix is important. That's why there's this argument too that you can sort of gain more from the micronutrients and the vitamins and minerals from actual food components and like the process of actually breaking those down versus like getting the same out of a multivitamin, let's say. Like, so that's where some of that, I think, is more just analogous and helps this conversation.
Yeah.
But this specific food matrix effect makes the food softer. You can eat it faster. It just enhances this like sensory experience, the sensory exposure time when you're eating it, which then there's some evidence saying that it blunts the satiety signals, all these kind of things that like that's a bit of a, again, a bit of an eye opener. So it's this dopaminergic response that you've heard that these foods are, beginning to cause. And you can't get control. If someone has a propensity to overeating, genetically, imagine what happens when you factor in some of these foods that are just all over the place.
Yep.
So there's that aspect. There's also the food additive aspect and how this can disrupt the gut microbiome. So the emulsifiers, the sweeteners, thickeners, colors, the things that I kind of like, I'm typically saying like, whatever, who cares?
Yeah.
They can negatively alter the composition and the function of the gut microbiome. And so that's kind of all I'll say on that, but it's certainly a thing. And a lot of people who know what it's like eating Halo Top with tons of sugar alcohols and what that can do to certain smells and things in the home, I think that's related. Again, looking at hyperpalatability and brain reward pathways, they call it like they say that these foods are engineered to achieve a bliss point, and it's the ultimate combination of sugar, salt, and fat. And so it makes the food maximally palatable, maximal sensory appeal.
Yeah.
And this is what activates that reward pathway, man. Like who hates when they're
I want my food to be maximally blissful. That I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily.
Yeah. And I think that like you're just really promoting cravings. You're promoting this loss of control over your environment. And it's tough to it is tough to, on the flip side, again, it's tough to argue these things. The last piece of this would be the process-induced contaminants, which this is BPA, the phthalates, microplastics, that kind of stuff, which is in and of itself controversial, but it's worth mentioning. These compounds can get into foods and lead to other negative health effects. So this was my personal bias with all of this.
Okay.
And instead of trying to summarize, since it's not really that long, but Alec Blennis on Instagram, he's like an ultra marathoner. He has like the Murph record time. He's awesome. And now Tyler likes him too. So
I do.
So he's just a good balance of, some evidence-based stuff, some practical stuff. He's a performance athlete himself too. So he's just kind of brings all these different flavors. He works with the general population as far as clients go. He made a post, and they're often like satirical, right? Like they're almost like memes for the most part. But he said 10 weeks ago, people consistently underestimate the value of meeting basic nutritional guidelines like consuming adequate protein and fiber, and overestimate the harm caused by specific foods that they've learned to fear. The data shows that eating enough nutritious foods is more important than restricting less nutritious ones, and that fitness status is a much stronger predictor of longevity than how much processed food you're eating. And all of these are backed by citations. He's just not on his high horse here.
Sure.
The more you train, the more calories you need, and the less you'll likely be to have any serious nutritional deficiencies, since high caloric flux diets allow for more variety, less restriction, and make it easier to meet nutritional requirements in spite of larger quantities of food that look bad by conventional standards. For example, the WHO recommends sugar intake stay below 5% of caloric intake. But did you know that an elite Kenyan marathoner's diet is typically 20% sugar? Their metabolic health is excellent. So yeah, he'll cherry pick some things there. While nutrition is important for athletic performance, the nutritional practices of elite athletes would shock most people, and there is there's a large margin of error when it comes to staying healthy when training volume is high. It's impossible to eat a diet that's technically good, i.e., high in protein, fiber, low saturated fats, some fruits and veggies, while also eating enough junk to convince someone that your diet is bad. On the flip side, it's absolutely possible to avoid processed foods while still failing to meet protein and fiber guidelines while overconsuming saturated fats and total calories. People in the latter group might wonder why their health and performance isn't where they want it to be despite eating clean, but I promise you it's not a mystery. So not exactly what we talked about.
No, that's well said.
But it resonates with me as I grapple, in my privileged life, grapple with making the right food choices and such.
Fair enough. Well, we've defended ultra-processed foods. Go enjoy your Twinkies.
Yeah.
That's not what we said. If you heard that, go listen to it again. That's it for us today. If you have any questions or want to hear more of this, send us an email, questions@askjoedimatteo.com. That's questions@askjoedimatteo.com. That website's where you can find this show, past episodes of the show. You can find all the products that we recommend. We have fantastic supplements, ultra-processed protein supplements, all there. Go check them out. They're actually really great for you and a great way to meet those macro goal needs while still having a normal lifestyle. All on the website, askjoedimatteo.com. Big thanks to everybody that makes this show happen. And we can't wait to hear from you. Give us a like, give us a thumbs up, share it with somebody you know that needs to hear all this. Thanks, guys. See you next time.